this is Melody, the massage therapist, and I'm with David Jones. And his dad was a professional baseball player in the 1930s. And it's so fascinating to me that I asked a favor of him, asked him if he would answer some questions about his dad. And he has some really cool memorabilia from the 30s. Okay, thanks. Okay, David?
Yes.
How old was your dad when he started playing baseball?
He played baseball out in western Oklahoma probably when he was starting to be about 15 years old. Back in those days, there was no Little League, there was no Colt League, no prior high school league really to play. So they played in sandlot. Whoever could pick up a bat and a baseball someplace, they went in basically out there to a cow pasture and they played baseball. He was 18 when he signed a professional baseball contract with the St. Louis Cardinals.
Wow.
And 18 years old, and he always said he was thrilled because Dad grew up on a ranch, and it's really hard work back in those days, moving cattle and being careful not to be kicked by horses and what have you. But one of the things that I've always treasured, this is a piece that shows that he was with the Cardinals, and I wanted to read a piece from the newspaper. It says, 13 rookies stay with contract ball players. Hurler, Jones, Fielder, Orengo, seen as bright prospects by Cardinal scouts. So there were 200 that reported for the rookie camp, and they only kept 13. And out of the 13, my father and one other infielder was notable. One of the highlights in here said, camp coaches last night expressed pleasure at the showing of 2 of the 13 recruits in particular. One is Bill Jones, a 180-pound youngster from Oklahoma City. He has a fine fastball, a good curve and control, and he towers 6 feet 2 inches tall. Back in those days, there weren't nearly as many baseball teams as there are now. So it was very difficult to break into Major League Ball, merely because they had a lot of semi-pro teams, but not a lot of pro teams.
So when you say how many teams were there for like pro teams?
I'm guessing probably the same in both the National and the American leagues, maybe about 8 in each side. And that was
and what year was that?
1934, when he first broke in. And one of the other things they didn't have, especially for pitchers, which is what he was something called Tommy John surgery, which today is used extensively for pitchers that get hurt, whether it's from tendon tear or what have you. And later on, I'll mention that Dad was doing very well until he hurt his arm very badly.
And he was left-handed?
He was right-handed.
Oh, right-handed. You're left-handed.
I was a left-handed pitcher. That's correct. And he always said I threw from the wrong side of the mound. Yeah. But he had a good career, and after he was released by the Cardinals, which was in 1935, because at that stage he just couldn't rehab his arm. So he left there, and in those days, in Akron, Ohio, there were ball clubs by teams, and it was called the Rubber City. Firestone, Cyberling, Goodyear, Goodrich, all these tire companies. They were very competitive between each other. They had great basketball teams and they had great baseball teams, but where they got their players from were people who had been professional either in basketball or baseball, and they hired them, gave them a job, and then they played for them. So Dad picked up with them, and later on I can show you some of the photos that he had. This was a picture of Dad out of uniform. And this is a picture of Dad in uniform. And this is he right here. And as you can see, he has his St. Louis Cardinals suit on. And at that time, he was in what they called the International League, and he was playing with a team in Springfield, Missouri. Later on, after he left Goodyear, as a matter of fact, here's another picture of him. This is he right here. And again, these were all the baseball players who had played professional baseball in various leagues, either all the way up to professional American or are we good? American or National League, but then they would come down and they'd finish out their career with local teams. This was taken from Dad's letter jacket. As you can see, it's a St. Louis Cardinal. And they each, especially the pitchers, had these jackets to keep their arms warm.
So it was just like any Letterman jacket, but with the professional Cardinals.
Right.
Very cool.
Yeah. So the pitchers, between innings, obviously had to keep their arms warm, so they had jackets which back in those days were wool. It got a little warm in the summer, but that's what they did. After he left Goodyear, he came to Canton, Ohio, and started his baseball career there, and played at that level at amateur baseball. It was called the NABA, National Association of Baseball, National Baseball Association, NBA. And he did extremely well there, winning many, many games and taking his teams to the championships in Michigan. That's generally where the finals were held every year. You have any other questions?
Tell me, you told me once when he was on the professional team that he had to stay with people. They didn't make much money.
Right.
Will you talk about that?
That's true. They didn't make much money at all, and he was fortunate enough to be spotted when he was pitching by a baseball buff in St. Louis who offered him a room at his home and free food, which for my father, that was quite a deal. Mm-hmm. And as a matter of fact, his name was Elwin, was his last name, and that turned out to be my middle name. So he was a very good friend of my father's, and back in those days, that meant a lot to just have some place you could stay and have your own room.
And was he having kids yet at that time?
No, actually he hadn't met my mother until 1937, when he was in Canton, Ohio, playing baseball at that time. And that was right before he left the professional arena and started playing for these local teams that they were sponsored by. Sporting goods companies would sponsor them and that type of thing.
But they didn't pay them.
They didn't. No. It was just a you just played for fun.
That was the way it was supposed to be, but my father was such a good pitcher that he got paid under the table.
That's great. So what was his day job? Did he continue to play baseball till he was 50 or 60 or?
He continued to play baseball until he was about 45 years old, and later on was a coach of baseball teams in the area. He went on to write a baseball book.
Oh, will you get that out?
Yes, I think we have it here somewhere. Let's find it. Oops, that's not it.
So what was his day job when
Well,
he
by
was...
that time, yes, he had started working for a company called Timken Roller Bearing, and he was what they called a tool hardener, and he was responsible. This was the book that he wrote called So You Want to Be a Pitcher, and it goes through all aspects of training young boys on conditioning and how not to hurt their arm, because a lot of kids started to throw curveballs and things much too young, and they ended up hurting their arms. So he was very concerned about that, and wrote this basically not only for the kids but also for the parents.
That's so cool. So he worked for Timken, a big company.
Yes, they make roller bearings and steel, and he worked for them for 32 years.
Were you born in Canton Day?
No, actually I was born in Jackson, Michigan,
So you were
and
there.
he was playing baseball for them in Jackson when he was with Goodyear in Jackson, and then they moved him back down to Akron, Ohio, and then eventually he went from there to Canton, Ohio.
Well, how did you meet your mother?
He met my mother. In those days, the hotels had very small rooms, but they had very large lobbies. So people would come down, everybody smoked in those days, and they'd have their cigarettes or cigars, and they'd read their paper in the lobbies. And my mother came, she was traveling at that time, which was sort of unusual for a single lady to be traveling, but my mother was a go-getter. And she stopped at the front desk and asked the manager if it would be okay for her to take a walk in the area. And back in those days, Canton, Ohio had a lot of gangs, very similar to Chicago.
And this was 30 what? 30?
This was back in the late 30s.
Mm-hmm.
And the manager said I wouldn't recommend that, and my father overheard that and went to the front desk and said he'd be honored to escort her, and that's how they met.
Wow,
Yeah.
very cool. Well, thank you, David. Tell us, I want just 2 minutes of, well, okay, it may take longer than 2 minutes. 2 minutes of your story, of your baseball world. Tell us a little bit about your world. How old were you when they had Little League when you were a little
They
boy?
did, yeah. I started when I was 9 years old, and I couldn't find the picture, but I had a picture of myself and 3 other individuals with Cy Young, who, if anybody knows anything about baseball, was the person that now sponsors the best pitcher in the National and American League each year is the Cy Young winner. So at that time, I think Cy was probably 80 years old, but I still treasure that picture.
Mm-hmm.
I pitched from the time I was 9 until I was 31. I had some no-hitters, one-hitters. We won championships both in Colt League and also in what they call the Amateur League in Canton, Ohio, which was very active at that time. We would get in the final championship games 2,000 to 3,000 people
Wow.
who would come and watch the game. So we had a great active league at that time. But it was to the point where we had 3 children. I just gotten promoted to go to New York out of Ohio, so I gave up the baseball.
But tell us about senior, what's it called? Senior World Champ. What did you do in Phoenix? You were playing baseball.
Oh, yeah.
What's that called?
Yeah, that's the Senior World Baseball League. It ranges anywhere from ages of 45 over or 75 and over. So I was talked into going and playing at one time when I was 65 years old. And unfortunately, on the first at bat, I got a hit and blew out my Achilles. So that was the end of my baseball career.
Ended your senior career.
It ended my senior career very quickly.
So, well, thank you, David, for
What year was that?
all that information, and happy baseball. Bye-bye.
As I mentioned earlier, I had my picture taken with Cy Young, and this is the gentleman right here. And this is me. As you can see, I was a little taller than some of the other little leaguers. I was big for my age, as they say. But it was quite an honor, and I have another picture of this in a shinier photo, but I'm very, very proud of that.